my what?
Motherfucker! What do you want, motherfucker? Come on, you get him!
Streets of Fury EX is both a fighting game and a beat 'em up. Both genres have one thing in common, the urge to knock the socks out of your enemies with nothing but bare knuckles. They are the antithesis to the shoot 'em ups and the shooters of today, where every solution is answered with a gun. There is, however, something immensely satisfying about beat 'em ups and fighting games that provide a unique flavor that you can't really get elsewhere, where focus and sometimes technical gameplay is polished to a T, where the skill ceiling is always scaling, but still leaving enough room for newcomers to come into the fold. In fighting games like, say, King of Fighters or Street Fighter, this is especially the case. Beat 'em ups, on the other hand, are the more laxative kind, while still being somewhat challenging. You could put in Streets of Rage or Shredder's Revenge and just pummel your way through the enemies, at least until you come across the game's skill checks. Streets of Fury EX, on the other hand, more or less does the same thing, lets you beat the shit out of enemies on the screen while simultaneously punishing you for poorly timed attacks or parries. It's, like I said, both a fighting game and a beat 'em up, and one of the funnest that I've played in the beat 'em up scene. This game is somewhat of a sleeper. Not a lot of people know about it unless you're like heavily into the beat 'em up scene. You might have heard of it. But if you've come off of Streets of Rage 4, then you might find out that the same team that made that game had also developed this game back in 2015, being developed and published by Guard Crush, one of the developers who had helped make Streets of Rage 4. Streets of Fury EX is a love letter to beat 'em ups, adding in its own unique approach to beat 'em up gameplay, giving you more than just punching and kicking, but a series of combos, chain attacks, strings, parries, that you can also see in other fighting games like, say, Guilty Gear, Marvel vs. Capcom, Dragon Ball FighterZ, or Street Fighter, albeit in a very wacky sense. The game is endearing and sometimes frustrating, but still puts a smile on my face every time I do play it. So, let's dive a bit more into it. The background story is pretty minimal, and you're not really going to care about it anyway. Basically, the French government are dealing with a gang-infested Paris that's no longer under their control. To bring order, they hired a group of fighters to come and clean up their mess, to clear out the gangs and make Paris safe again, and that's pretty much it. The rest of the game, though, is where you're going to ignore it entirely because there's nothing really to work with in terms of the story, other than it just providing context to what you're doing and why. In any case, the setting is again based in Paris, and it consists of several areas, from subways to streets, and eventually the Eiffel Tower itself. The progression sums up to two main things: clearing sections and eventually the boss of that level. The levels are divided up into their own areas, each with their own boss. You'll be comboing your way through a multitude of different enemies, giving them the beat 'em up treatment, On one hand, the progression it's simple, but on the other, it also comes with its challenges that can at times frustrate the player. For starters, a lot of the enemies each have their own unique attacks and combos, as well as different effects indicated by the altered color that distinguishes them into different versions of those characters. Collectively though, it makes for a really rough time if you try and tackle everything at once. Fights can be really chaotic, and getting sandwiched between multiple opponents can lead to a beach ball session, with you being the ball. In terms of the gameplay, Streets of Fury EX, it's pretty similar to other beat 'em up games that you may have played, like whether it could be, Streets of Rage, or Fight and Rage, Double Dragon, River City Girls, Shredder's Revenge, Mother Russia Bleeds, so on and so forth. The levels have several lanes, or 3 planes, that you can move up and down on, and it's something that you'll be relying on in order to avoid special attacks or devastating combos from the enemies. But like I've already said, the game does borrow from the fighting game genre as well. What it brings is a pretty large range of moves and abilities that can be used in sequence when done correctly. Going from basic hits to juggles in the air, then finishing with a Fury combo, is one of the things that can be immensely satisfying when performed correctly in the game. The later difficulties and challenge modes will require that you have a handle on your character's abilities and movesets. Speaking of which, there are a lot of them, 24 to be exact. And these aren't your drawn from scratch sprites that you would see in other beat 'em up games, most notably Streets of Rage 4, but real life people that have had all of their choreography recorded, edited, and then programmed into the game. A lot of them you may or may not know, but there is that guy with the glasses. The way they've integrated these people into the game is part of why I like this game so much. It adds an organic flavour to the experience, creating something that looks somewhat realistic, giving off believable animations rather than exaggerated ones like you see in Dragon Ball FighterZ. It's not unlike the way the original Mortal Kombat games used actors to create the animations for their games. You'll notice though that the game does have a lot of wacky animations, but it's more on the side of people just mucking around and having a good time, rather than just being an anime character being brought to life. The animations are wacky but work within the game's tongue-in-cheek nature. The enemies share the same silliness with their own attacks and combos, and you can even play as some of them. In saying that, the game's tone may or may not be for you, but if you can look past its silliness, it makes for an awesome beat 'em up game. With the combat itself, you have your standard light and heavy attacks, and using the directional pad whether it's up or down makes for different attacks as well. The beat button is a more specialized attack that comes at the partial cost of your guard meter, which is important to keep track of because if it depletes, it stuns you for a second or two, leaving you open to enemy attacks. You can block or parry, where the former creates a meter for a counter while simultaneously draining your guard, and the parry freezes an enemy and gives you bonus damage, which is really helpful for certain enemies that are annoying to deal with, like the guys with nunchucks. Then finally you have the Fury combos. There's 3 variations of it assigned to different buttons, each character having their own of course. To use them you need to fill up your Fury meter, which can be done by doing combos and dealing damage. It's something to be used frequently, especially later on in the campaigns as they get harder, which are divided into 2 plans, Plan A and Plan B, with one being the default and the other being a remix of sorts, while still having different story elements. When it comes to difficulty, it bases itself with an old school approach. You die, you lose lives, and when you lose all of your lives, it's game over and you have to start the campaign again. There are various levels of difficulties that can be unlocked by upgrading your security. And what is your security exactly? Well, it's the game's progression system that unlocks new characters, new difficulty modes, and also new modifiers for the custom mode. The easiest difficulty gives you 99 lives, so you never have to worry about a game over. Or you can play on Insane, which doubles the enemies and bosses on screen, with limited lives as well. It's a game that's quite challenging at times, and the variety of enemies is its strength and its weakness. The variation is great, but the presence of multiple foes can make for a nightmarish experience, culminating in a clusterfuck at times that leads to a lot of damage taken. The mechanics, like the blocking and the parry, can be counter-parried and counter-attacked when you're doing it to a cluster of enemies in front of you that have simultaneous actions or different actions at different times. Having a group of the same enemies is one thing, but multiple variations is another, which is precisely why the levels give you a lot of room to cover. You're encouraged to isolate the more dangerous foes so that they don't collectively fuck up your session. Doing multiple groups most of the time is suicide in this game, especially when you're trying to get a high score on survival mode. Leveling up the security meter does take a bit of time, but the more you play it and the better you do, the more you'll unlock. After you've completed the main 2 campaigns, You then have the challenge mode, each with their own requirements and obstacles. They're quite difficult and aiming for 3 stars will take some time, but there's enough content on here to keep you busy. Otherwise, you can always do a rerun of the campaign using the custom difficulty, where you can really make it slow and sluggish with 5 times enemy health, or the complete opposite where you can tear bosses like a piece of paper. This mode is great because you can customize the experience of the game to the fullest. The only problem is that it can only be fully realized once you've grinded the security levels to 100 where you have access to all of the modifiers, which is assuming that you really enjoy the game enough to play through the whole thing multiple times. Otherwise, you may just move on once you've gotten your feel of the game. Streets of Fury EX is a really fun game with a mix of frustrations that come from unfair enemy combinations that can disrupt the flow of combat, and the somewhat repetitive nature of the campaign where there aren't really a lot of maps to play around in, where the later maps in Plan B are just sort of like remixes of Plan A but with different enemy placements. And yet, it's a game that I still play from time to time. The game is just endearing from start to finish, like it was made with genuine love and care for the genres that Streets of Fury is based on. It has a ton of characters with unique playstyles, a fun soundtrack that fits the mood of each level, a great difficulty system, and other modes that enable more replay value. But if you're looking for a more tight and focused beat-em-up experience like Streets of Rage 2 or 4 or the Streets of Rage remake, then you'll have to put those reservations aside and accept the game for what it is. A silly but fun beat-em-up game with some enjoyable combat, with silly animations, with a Mortal Kombat sprite approach, using real-life people instead of drawn sprites from scratch like in Streets of Rage 4. The game is a reminder that sometimes you just want to make something that doesn't take itself too seriously. You don't always need a grand generation spanning saga of a story to make a great game. Sometimes, all you really need is a pair of hands and legs, and a group of detestable foes to beat the shit out of. If that's what you're looking for, something that carries the spirit of the beat 'em up and fighting genre, then Streets of Fury EX is absolutely worth looking into. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.
Get